And we're really pleased to have back with us from Washington the deputy editor, Congressional White House reporter for Military Times, good friend of the American Legion, and that is Leo Shea. Leo, how are you today?
I appreciate you inviting me back. I wish we had less to talk about than we do, but it's good to be on.
Yeah. No, this would have been the Washington conference for the American Legion. You led a panel with leading members of Congress at that a couple of years ago, and we hope to get back to it. But so much happening with Ukraine. Some of it is optimistic news. What's the latest that you've heard from Ukraine? There were going to be some kind of talks between the Russians and Ukraine officials today.
Yeah, the latest I've heard there is that hasn't produced anything significant. But look, I mean, I think your listeners have seen a lot of the same reports that we have. That what if Russia thought this was going to be a quick and swift, decisive victory? That's not the case. The Ukrainian military is really putting up a strong fight, and I think it's interesting if we can step back a little bit just to understand. In 2014, when when Russia sort of stormed into Ukraine, took over Crimea, that was a military that wasn't ready to stand up to Russia. Now, after years of training with U.S. troops, with foreign U.S. allies, this is a much more professional U.S. force. When we talk about sending troops places, when we talk about sending equipment, we don't always account for the importance of those years of training and those years of work that are done by series of service members, American service members, and training these guys up so that when they face this, now we're seeing a very professional Ukrainian military as opposed to a Russian military that frankly looks like they don't know what they're doing with logistics and supply chains and things like that.
Yeah, we heard a West Point friend of ours, Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, on the air talking about how ineffective the Russian armor tactics are, and there was another report that the Russians are limited to being on the roads. They're not out on the fields where they can spread out, so they're sitting ducks for the Ukrainians. Why are the Russians struggling so much with this?
I mean, look, I'm not the military strategist expert that some of my colleagues are, so I'm learning from them as we see it. But you don't know the strength of a military until they fight, and this, frankly, is the first time in a while that Russia has tried a ground invasion like this, has tried a massive military assault of this sort. And when they're facing a better Western trained military than they expect, they're running into some of these problems. So I know for a fact that there's a lot of folks at West Point, a lot of folks in the DoD today who are studying pretty closely the mistakes being made by the Russians and making sure that that's not in that's in the American playbook from now on. They're learning lessons about how they're approaching things and what are common pitfalls, what aren't. But I think part of what the Russians discounted here, frankly, was just how much the Ukrainians were going to be willing to stand up and fight for themselves. And we know this from past wars. We know this from the dedication of an all-volunteer force right now. When you have people who really believe in the cause, not just people who are conscripted and forced into military service, as many foreign militaries do, you have people who care. You have people who are professional soldiers, and you have a better fighting force.
And just driving in, I heard General Wes Clark talking about the need to replenish the Ukraines, and that Jack, my colleague, noted that the Germans are making a major contribution of military equipment, and so is our other allies from NATO. How will the Russians respond to that the NATO allies are resupplying Ukraine?
Yeah, we're already seeing some Russian officials saying there'll be serious consequences for any countries that aid Ukraine and are working against them. Look, we'll see. What we've learned in all this is that Vladimir Putin is not a stable leader, is not a person who we can predict, and is not someone who's making rational decisions. If he was, I don't think we'd be in this current situation. So, the threat of nuclear war is something that we as a country haven't had to stare down since the end of the Cold War, but we may be entering that period again, and that's a really scary and sobering thought that we may be dealing with a Russian state that's in turmoil and has a unpredictable, erratic leader, much like North Korea, but a much more potent military arsenal than we've seen, potentially world-ending arsenal than we've seen with some of these other folks.
One thing my colleague Jack McGuirk brought up in the first segment is the cyber attacks that are going on there have been attacks on Ukraine institutions, banks. But that's one of the things that the United States and NATO allies can counterattack on, because you don't see the actions on cyber. And the U.S. is very good at cyber. We get to watch some of the exercises at West Point. Has there been any indication that the U.S. has been able to counter some of the Russian cyber attacks?
There's been discussion about the United States and NATO allies going on the offensive there, but so far they've decided to step back at this point. I think it's still in assistance mode. They're monitoring. As you said, there have been quite a few cyber attacks on Ukrainian sites and infrastructure, but I think even those are a little less severe than some of the predictors thought before all of this started. So look, this is still less than a week into the fight. Obviously, we get to do a lot of armchair quarterbacking from over here, where the people of Ukraine are actually suffering and dealing with all this. But there is a very strong showing of international support for Ukraine at this point, and I think that message is getting across, and hopefully that sort of, that theme, that support starts to resonate in Russia, where you've got folks who are just doing what they want at this point and not looking at what the international community would support or thinks is rational action.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about sanctions that have been applied that might in some ways limit the resources financially that Russia can draw on. Is there any... What's the feeling on Capitol Hill about any other actions that the United States and NATO can take?
Well, there is talk right now. So the Congress still has not finalized the budget for this fiscal year. We're 6 months into this fiscal year, and they're still working on that. They're hoping to do that in the next couple of weeks. But there's discussion now about adding several billion more on for additional Ukrainian support, albeit military equipment, humanitarian assistance, things of that sort. So Speaker Pelosi was asked about it earlier today. She said she's just waiting for a specific proposal from the White House to decide where to go, but that she believes there's plenty in her caucus and plenty in both chambers that will support some sort of financial aid and equipment aid from here. So we should see that moving. I would guess by the end of the week we'll start to see a framework for it. Maybe beginning of next week, maybe that money might start flowing over there.
Very good. Now we're talking with Leo Shane, who is the deputy editor of Military Times, a leading Congressional and White House reporter. And our colleague Jack McGuirk has been following the VA all through the pandemic. And Jack, I know you got a question.
Yeah, what's the latest on that situation? I remember seeing the statistics saying I think it was over 20,000 COVID patients have sadly passed away due to COVID complications.
Yeah, we're approaching 21,000 now. Actually Friday is the 2-year anniversary of the first COVID case that entered the VA system. So they've had over 606,000 cases, almost 21,000 deaths when you include VA employees in that case, about 250 VA employees, and then various veterans that were either in the system or connected to the system. So, look, the cost is mind-boggling. It has been difficult for the world, difficult for the country, but within VA, we've seen a higher mortality rate from COVID because you're often dealing with patients, individuals who have other health issues. And what we know is if you had other illnesses, if you had respiratory illnesses to start with and you caught COVID, you were more likely to die from it. So it's something that the VA is still pushing folks. Make sure you're getting vaccinated. Make sure that you know how to contact VA if you have problems, and really watch out for yourself. Be safe because we care for our veterans and we want to protect them as best we can.
And we never forget those 240 employees of the Department of Veterans Affairs who have died of COVID. Taking care of patients, and that is just such extraordinary service that they've provided.
Absolutely. I mean, look, it's a health system that has been severely taxed, and I know there's a lot of employees out there that are exhausted, but are still dedicated to making sure that the veterans and their families get the best care they have. So we've heard that a lot from Secretary McDonough in recent weeks. Just how impressed he is with their dedication and their focus on the mission, even as a lot of them dealt with problems at home, even as they dealt with kids being homeschooled, as they dealt with their own loved ones dealing with health issues. This is something that affected the whole country, but did not shake the mission or change the mission of the Department of Veterans Affairs.
And Leo, we just have about 30 seconds left, but I wanted you to touch on two pieces of legislation to take care of veterans who are dealing with burn pit-related illnesses and also changes to the GI Bill.
Yeah, on the burn pit one, just keep an eye this week on the House. There's going to be a major piece of legislation called the PACT Act that gets debated. Could have very sweeping effects, effective as many as 1 in every 5 veterans in America with some toxic exposure issues. And the GI Bill, we're tracking all of that. There's some big things. I know the American Legion has been pushing for some updated stuff for looking at online schools a little differently, especially in the wake of the pandemic. So, when we get back to some non-Ukraine normal news, these are the things that are going to be dominating the headlines in the veterans world.
Absolutely. Leo Shane, Deputy Editor of Military Times, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to doing it again very soon.
Oh, anytime. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Leo, and appreciate Leo. We saw him on Meet the Press a few months ago, and just one of the most respected military veterans reporters in Washington. Glad that we can call on him.